Hi, Moskowitz here. Welcome to Chapter 4, Who Has Won to Mastership, Part 2 of Call of the Wild. In the very last section of Chapter 4, the dogs were all sold. Their new owner is what's referred to as a Scotch half-breed, and you have to remember this is over 100 years old, and so this is not a term that you would use nowadays, but historically, half-breed referred to someone who's biracial or had multiple ethnicities. So it could have been he was half Scotch and half Native American or some other combination. So Buck's been sold to a mail carrier, and the trail is hard to navigate again. So they went from smooth sailing, he proved his leadership, to suddenly now they're going to come across hardship and conflict again. All right, let's read. A Scotch half-breed took charge of him and his mates, and in company with a dozen other dog teams, he started back. Hold on, turn the volume up. He started back over the weary trail to Dawson. It was no light running now, nor record time, but heavy toil each day, and with a heavy load behind, for this was the main trail, carrying word from the world to the men who sought gold under the shadow of the pole. So without the mail, you have no word from home and the rest of America. So one of the things to remember is that the mail delivery service, there's no internet, there's no phone, there may be some telegraph lines, but letter to letter, person to person transmission of information is one of the main ways that the mail carriers bring newspapers, they bring letters from home, they bring receipts and bills. All right. Buck did not like it, but he bore up well to the work, taking pride in it after the manner of Dave and Sol-Leks, and seeing that his mates, whether they prided in it or not, did their fair share. It was a monotonous life, operating with machine-like regularity. One day was very like another. At a certain time each morning, the cooks turned out, fires were built, and breakfast was eaten. Then, while some broke camp, others harnessed the dogs, and they were under their way. An hour or so before the darkness fell, which gave warning of dawn. At night, camp was made. Some pitched the flies, others cut firewood and pine boughs for the beds, and still others carried water or ice for the cooks. Also, the dogs were fed. To them, this was the one feature of the day, though it was good to loaf around after the fish was eaten for an hour or so with the other dogs, of which there was 5 score and odd. There were fierce fighters among them, but 3 battles with the fiercest brought Buck to mastery, so that when he bristled and showed his teeth, they got out of the way. So you have all these dogs by the fire, and they're having like these dog competitions to see who's on top. And Buck has to like reprove himself. So he had to fight his way to being alpha dog all over again, but he is able to rise to the top. Let me pull this up. All right. Best of all, perhaps, he loved to lie near the fire, hind legs crouched under him, forelegs stretched out in front, head raised, and eyes blinking dreamily at the flames. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller's big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley, and of the cement swimming tank, and Isabel, the Mexican hairless dog, and Toots, the Japanese pug. But oftener he remembered the man in the red sweater, the death of Curly, the great fight with Spitz, and the good things he had eaten or would like to eat. He was not homesick. The Sunland was very dim and distant, and such memories had no power over him. Far more potent were the memories of his heredity that gave things he had never seen before a seeming familiarity. The instincts, which were but the memories of his ancestors, became habits, which had lapsed in later days and still later in him quickened and became alive again. So one of the things that's happening is he does have these kind of quick flashes to kind of remembering his past, but it's not in a homesick way. It's not like he idealizes it. It's something like far away, almost like in a dream. And what he spends more time thinking about are the things that have helped him overcome, or the lessons that he's learned, like the man in the red sweater who taught him the law of club and fang, or his fight with Spitz, which led him to like this alpha dog position. And he's definitely again tapping into this kind of native primordial instincts. So sometimes, as he crouched there, blinking dreamily at the flames, it seemed that the flames were of another fire, and that as he crouched by this other fire, he saw another and different man from the half breed cook before him. This other man was shorter of leg and longer of arm, with muscles that were stringy and knotty rather than rounded and swelling. The hair of the man was long and matted, and his head slanted back under it from the eyes. He uttered strange sounds and seemed very much afraid of the darkness, into which he peered continually, clutching in his hand, which hung midway between between knee and foot, a stick with a heavy stone made fast to the end. He was all but naked, a ragged, fire-scorched skin hanging part way down his back, but on his body there was much hair. In some places, across the chest and shoulders and down the outside of the arms and thighs, it was matted into almost a thick fur. He did not stand erect, but with trunk inclined forward from the hips, on legs that bent at the knees. About his body there was a peculiar springiness or resiliency, almost cat-like, and a quick alertness of one who lived in perpetual fear of things seen and unseen. So this is a very kind of esoteric, symbolic part of the story where you have Buck and he's staring into this fire and he's having visions of the past, visions of the earliest primordial man. Um, so Neanderthals or cavemen are the earliest humans that came in contact with dogs and befriended them. And fire is one of the things that drew dogs and wild wolf-like creatures into the fold of man and helped them become domesticated. So this is another symbol of Buck becoming more and more wild. At other times, this vision of the hairy man squatted by the fire with head between his legs and slept. On such occasions, his elbows were on his knees and his hands clasped above his head as though to shed rain by the hairy arms. And beyond the fire in the circling darkness, Buck could see gleaming coals 2 by 2, always 2 by 2, which he knew to be the eyes of great beasts of prey, and he could hear the crashing of their bodies through the undergrowth and the noises they made in the night. And dreaming there by the Yukon bank with lazy eyes blinking at the fire, these sounds and sights of another world would make the hair to rise along the back and stand on across the shoulders and up his neck, till he whimpered low and suppressedly or growled softly, and the half-breed cook shouted at him, "Hey, you, Buck, wake up!" Whereupon the other world would vanish, and the real would come into his eyes, and he would get up and yawn and stretch as though he had been asleep. So he's perceived by the outside world, the cook, as being in a deep sleep, but it's different than that because this language at the end, which it says as though he had been asleep, indicates that it's different than that. It's almost like a meditative, dreamlike state that he's in. Um, but these physical indications of like the hair standing up on the back of, his, all along the ridge of his back, those type of things concern the cook who looks at him and is wondering, all right, he's having a bad dream. But in reality, it's almost like he's tapping into this history of being a dog in the wild. It was a hard trip with the mail behind them, and the heavy work wore them down. They were short of weight and in poor condition when they made Dawson, and should have had 10 days or a week's rest at least. But in 2 days' time, they dropped down the Yukon bank from the barracks, loaded with letters for the outside. The dogs were tired, the drivers grumbling, and to make matters worse, it snowed every day. This meant a soft trail, greater friction on the runners, and heavier pulling for the dogs. Yet the drivers were fair through it and did their best for the animals. Each night the dogs were attended to first. They ate before the drivers ate, and no man sought his sleeping robe till he had seen to the feet of the dogs he drove. Still, their strength went down, and since the beginning of the winter, they had traveled. Hold on one second. They had traveled 800 miles, dragging sleds the whole weary distance, and 1,800 miles will toll upon life of the toughest. Buck stood it, keeping his mates up to their work and maintaining discipline, though he too was very tired. Billy cried and whimpered regularly in his sleep each night, and Joe was sourer than ever, and Sol-leks was unapproachable, blind side or other side. But it was Dave who suffered most of all. Something had gone wrong with him. He became more morose and irritable, and when camp was pitched, at once made his nest where his driver fed him. Once out of the harness and down, he did not get off his feet again till harness up time in the morning. Sometimes, in the traces, when jerked by a sudden stoppage of the sled or by straining to start, he would cry out in pain, and the driver examined him but could find nothing. All the drivers became interested in his case. They talked about it at mealtime and over their last pipes before going to bed. And one night they held a consultation. He was brought from his nest to the fire and was pressed and prodded till he cried out many times. Something was wrong inside, but they could not locate no broken bones and they could not make it out. So poor Dave is suffering from some kind of illness or cancer, or just the fact that he's been worked to death this entire time. So he doesn't like resting. If you remember from earlier in the story, he's one of the ones that's just waiting and raring to like get up and go and drive that sled. So even though he's sick and suffering, um, he's trying to work and be happy and do what he normally does. So now you have all these men and they're trying to figure out what is the best thing to do. You don't have vets, you're in the wild, and it seems like he's suffering more and more each day. By the time Cassiar Bar was reached, he was so weak, this is Dave, that he was repeatedly falling in the traces. The Scotch half-breed called a halt and took him out of the team, making the next dog, Sol-Leks, fast to the sled. His intention was to rest Dave, letting him run free behind the sled. Sick as he was, Dave resented being taken out, grunting and growling while the traces were unfastened, and whimpered broken-heartedly when he saw Sol-Leks in the position he had held and served so long. For the pride of trace and trail was his, and sick unto death, he could not bear that another dog should do his work. So this part is heartbreaking. So he sees that his position has been usurped or taken over by the other dogs. And, the humans, they think that they're giving him a break. They're like, this will be less work for him. It's not going to hurt him so much. But his dog ego and pride is so strong that he just wants to be in his regular role. So he runs along with the lead anyways and tries to do his job. Lugubriously means sadly when we come across that word. All right. So when the sled started, he floundered in the snow alongside the beaten trail, attacking Sol-Leks with his teeth, rushing against him and trying to thrust him off into the soft snow on the other side, striving to leap inside his traces and get between him and the sled, and all the while whining and yelping and crying with grief and pain. And the half-breed tried to drive him away with the whip, but he paid no heed to the stinging lash, and the man had not the heart to strike harder. Dave refused to run quietly on the trail behind the sled, where the going was easy, but continued to flounder alongside in the soft snow, where the going was difficult till he was exhausted. Then he fell and lay where he fell, howling lugubriously as the long train of sleds churned by. With the last remnant of strength, he managed to stagger along behind till the train made another stop. When he floundered past the sleds to his own, when he stood behind Sol-Leks, his driver lingered a moment to get a light for his pipe from the man behind. Then he returned and started his dogs. They swung out on the trail with remarkable lack of exertion, turned their heads uneasily, and stopped in surprise. The driver was surprised, too. The sled had not moved. He called his comrades to witness the sight. Dave had bitten through both of Sol-Leks' traces and was standing directly in the front of the sled in his proper place. So at this point, Dave cannot bear to not do his job. Excuse me a second. Sorry, the computer was going to die. Horrible moment for that to happen. So Dave has chewed out the leather and put himself in the part. And, well, let's read a little bit further and then I'll explain. He pleaded with his eyes to remain there. The driver was perplexed. His comrades talked about how a dog could break its heart through being denied the work that killed it, and recalled instances they had known where dogs too old for the toil or injured had died because they were cut out of the traces. Also, they held it a mercy, since Dave was going to die anyways, that he should die in the traces, heart easy, content. So he was harnessed in again, and proudly he pulled. As of old, though more than once he cried out involuntarily from the bite of his inward hurt. Several times he fell down and was dragged in the traces, and once the sled ran upon him, and he limped thereafter in one of the hind legs. But he held out till camp was reached, and when his driver made a place for him by the fire, morning found him too weak to travel. At harness time, he tried to crawl to the driver. By convulsive efforts, he got onto his feet, staggered, and fell. And then he wormed his way forward slowly toward where the harness was being put on his mates. He would advance his foreleg and drag up his body with a sort of hitching movement, where he would advance his forelegs and hitch again for a few more inches. His strength left him, and at the last his mates saw him. He lay gasping in the snow and yearning toward them, but they could hear him mournfully howling till they passed out of sight behind the belt of river timber. So at this point, they have to keep going, and Dave can't travel, and he's crawling towards them, but they have to leave without him. Here the train was halted. The Scots half-breed slowly retraced his steps to the camp they had left. The men ceased talking, a revolver shot rang out, and the man came back hurriedly. The whip snapped, the bells tinkled merrily, the sledge churned along the trail, but Buck knew, and every dog knew, what had taken place behind the belt of the river trees. So, eventually, at that point where they stop, the driver goes back and they shoot Dave to put him out of his misery because he's been abandoned by the sled team. And if you think about the whole way this chapter opens with Buck learning these lessons from things in the past that have happened to him, this is definitely going to be another profound lesson of you're only good as long as you're good. And then when you can't work anymore. And poor Dave, who wouldn't give up till the very end. And it is the thing that killed him that he loved. He had this passion for being in the sled, being in the traces. But in the end, that's what finally broke him and wore him down. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the end of this chapter. I'm very happy that I'm revisiting this novel. I forgot this is a novel that I thoroughly have always enjoyed teaching, and I haven't taught it in a long time. And one of those kind of Corona bonuses, I guess, is that I got to revisit teaching it again, and the writing is really powerful and gives you a good idea of what it means to, as a writer, really bring across human emotions and being, even if it's through the story of an animal. All right, I'll see you next time. Hope you ended chapter 4, Call the Wild.